Imagine a voice that once soared across concert halls, a face that lit up silver screens, and a woman who seemed to embody hope, joy, and perfect harmony. She captivated millions. Children pointed in awe, audiences held their breath, and generations grew up singing her songs. She became not just a star, but a symbol. Now imagine that behind that radiant image, something quietly changed. The voice trembled. The spotlight shifted. The magic, it seemed, began to fade. At 90, the story of Julie Andrews is not simply a tale of fairy tales fulfilled. It is a story that leaves you stunned, saddened, and deeply moved. Because while the outward image stayed immaculate, the inward journey was far more complex, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than most ever imagined. In this video, we will follow her from the heights of stardom to the shadows of loss. The tragedy you may never have known. By the end, you might look back at her with new eyes. Not just the magical nanny, not just the perfect voice, but a woman who paid a price. Stay with us, because what you will learn is surprising, haunting, and ultimately unforgettable. Long before the world knew her as Mary Poppins or Maria Von Trapp, Julie Andrews was just a small girl in post-war England, bright-eyed, uncertain, and living in a world that was trying to rebuild itself from ashes. Born Julia Elizabeth Wells on October 1, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, her childhood was far from the glossy perfection that would later define her screen image. The world saw her as pure and unbreakable, but the reality began in a household that was anything but stable. Her mother, Barbara Ward Wells, was a talented pianist and singer who performed in vaudeville acts. Her stepfather, Ted Andrews, was a tenor and entertainer as well. But behind the curtain of show business, the home life was chaotic, filled with financial struggles, infidelities, and emotional tension. Julie's parents divorced when she was young, and she soon discovered that the man she called Dad was not her biological father. It was a revelation she would only learn about years later, one that quietly haunted her sense of identity. Music, however, became both her refuge and her weapon. From the moment she could stand at a piano, she could mimic notes with near-perfect precision. Her stepfather recognized her unusual gift and pushed her to train. It was not always gentle guidance. Ted Andrews was demanding, and Julie was expected to perform even as a child. But she did. And when she sang, everything else fell away. Her mother, who saw the growing gift in her daughter, arranged singing lessons with the acclaimed vocal coach Madame Lillian Stiles-Allen. Under her tutelage, Julie's voice developed into something almost supernatural, a crystalline, 4-octave soprano that few human beings could ever hope to possess. Even at the age of 10, her tone was clear, steady, and startlingly mature. She began performing in her parents' stage act during the bleak years of World War II, standing on makeshift stages in bomb-scarred towns, singing to soldiers and civilians alike. In a country struggling for hope, the sound of that child's voice became a kind of healing. It wasn't just talent, it was something transcendent, a reminder that beauty could still exist amid ruin. But those early years were not the simple story of a prodigy rising. Behind the applause were sleepless nights, endless travel, and the loneliness of being a child who had to be an adult far too soon. She grew up in dressing rooms, between train stations and theaters, her childhood spent not in play but in rehearsals and performances. Still, Julie didn't complain. She learned discipline early, a discipline that would define her entire life. By the time she was 12, she was performing solo at the London Palladium for King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause, stunned by the sound coming from such a small frame. That night, the young girl from Surrey became a sensation. What no one could have guessed then was how much that voice, that precious gift, would one day define her entire existence, and later, become the source of her deepest heartbreak. The post-war years brought new opportunities to London's theatre world, and by her teens, Julie Andrews was already being recognized as one of its brightest young talents. She made her professional solo debut in 1948 at just 13 years old, singing Je suis Titania from Mignon, one of the most demanding coloratura arias ever written. It was an audacious choice, and she performed it flawlessly. The audience was astonished. Critics compared her voice to a bell, pure and effortless. Soon, the stages of the West End began to open their doors. In 1949, she appeared in Starlight Roof, a musical revue that showcased her soaring soprano. One of the guests in the audience that night would later recall, "When that girl sang, the whole theater seemed to stop breathing." She was still just a teenager, yet carried herself with the grace of a seasoned performer. Her reputation grew rapidly, and by the early 1950s she had become one of Britain's most in-demand young vocalists, performing on BBC Radio and on stage across the country. But it was her move across the Atlantic that would change everything. In 1954, at the age of 19, Julie Andrews was invited to audition for the Broadway production of The Boyfriend, a light-hearted musical set in the 1920s. Her fresh voice and refined English poise captured the producers immediately. When she stepped onto a New York stage for the first time, audiences were enchanted. She was young, beautiful, and unlike anything Broadway had seen in years, poised yet humble, disciplined yet radiant. The success of The Boyfriend led to something even bigger, an audition for a new musical adaptation of George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. The musical would be called My Fair Lady, and it would become a theatrical legend. As Eliza Doolittle, Julie Andrews delivered a performance that critics called miraculous. Her transformation from the rough-voiced Cockney flower girl to a refined lady mirrored her own life's journey. The show opened in 1956 and ran for over 6 years, becoming one of Broadway's most celebrated productions. Overnight, Julie Andrews was not just a stage actress, she was a star. She was nominated for a Tony Award, appeared on magazine covers, and became the darling of American theater. Yet even in her meteoric rise, she remained modest and deeply grounded. She often spoke about how surreal it felt to be in New York, away from her family, performing night after night to packed audiences. What most people didn't see was the pressure she placed on herself. Every performance had to be perfect. Every note had to meet the standard she had been raised to maintain. She would spend hours warming up before shows, sometimes until her throat ached. Her voice was her instrument, and she guarded it with everything she had. By the end of the 1950s, she was no longer just a theater star, she was a phenomenon. Disney took notice, as did Hollywood. The little girl who once sang in wartime shelters was about to step into the bright, demanding world of film. No one could have known that this next chapter would make her one of the most beloved figures in cinematic history, or that hidden within that same ascent lay the seeds of a future heartbreak so devastating it would nearly silence her forever. When Julie Andrews first stepped off the plane in Los Angeles in the early 1960s, she was filled with uncertainty. Broadway had made her a star, but Hollywood was a different world, one that devoured dreams as easily as it created them. Still, fate had something extraordinary in store for her. Walt Disney himself had seen her on Broadway in Camelot and was struck by her warmth, humor, and commanding presence. He invited her to audition for a new musical fantasy about a magical nanny. Andrews, pregnant at the time, was hesitant, but Disney insisted he would wait. When she finally accepted the role, she could not have imagined what was about to happen. In 1964, Mary Poppins premiered, and Julie Andrews became a legend overnight. Her performance was effortless, radiant, whimsical, yet deeply human. She could sing, dance, and move with grace, but more than that, she carried an emotional sincerity that reached beyond the screen. Children adored her, adults admired her, and critics called her a revelation. The film became a global phenomenon, earning her an Academy Award for Best Actress. At just 29 years old, she stood before the world, elegant and composed, holding the golden statuette that confirmed her as Hollywood's new queen. Yet, behind the smiles and acceptance speeches, she was still a British girl far from home, trying to make sense of the blinding spotlight that suddenly surrounded her. The success of Mary Poppins led directly to her next role, the one that would define her forever. In 1965, Julie Andrews starred in The Sound of Music. From the moment she ran across the Austrian hills singing "The Hills Are Alive," the world fell in love all over again. The film was more than a success, it was a cultural event. Families around the globe sang along to Do Re Mi and My Favorite Things. Mothers named their daughters Maria. Julie Andrews became not just an actress but a symbol of hope, grace, and purity in a turbulent decade marked by war and social change. Critics praised her for bringing light to the darkest of years. Her face was everywhere: magazines, talk shows, posters, and newsreels. She was now the embodiment of perfection, the ideal woman, the perfect mother figure, the voice that seemed incapable of sadness. But what the audience saw was a carefully crafted image. Hollywood adored her because she represented wholesomeness, the kind of immaculate femininity the world longed for. Yet Julie herself often struggled under that expectation. She was warm and genuine, yes, but she was also ambitious, intelligent, and deeply introspective. She knew that the same perfection that made her beloved could one day trap her. Still, in those years, it was impossible not to be in awe of her. Every smile, every note, every gesture seemed touched by light. And even as she began to suspect how fragile that light could be, she kept moving forward, giving the world everything she had. The films that followed, Thoroughly Modern Millie, the Americanization of Emily Starr, continued to showcase her versatility. Yet as the 1960s drew to a close, something began to shift. Audiences were changing. The world was becoming edgier, more cynical, and less interested in innocence. Julie Andrews would soon find herself fighting to redefine who she was in an industry that only wanted her to stay exactly the same. As the world sang along to her melodies, Julie Andrews quietly faced the side of fame that no one saw. Behind the cheerful image of Mary Poppins and Maria Von Trapp was a woman navigating the immense pressures of global stardom, motherhood, and artistic identity. Her first marriage to costume designer Tony Walton had begun during her early career and seemed picture-perfect from the outside. They had a daughter, Emma, and for a time it appeared that Julie had everything: success, family, admiration. But the relentless schedule of filming, traveling, and publicity wore on the marriage. By the late 1960s, they amicably divorced, both recognizing that fame had taken its toll. It was around this period that Julie began to push against her own image. She didn't want to be confined to playing the perfect woman. She accepted more complex and daring roles, dramatic films like the Americanization of Emily and Darling Lily, but audiences struggled to accept her in anything that wasn't pure and wholesome. Darling Lily, a World War I spy musical co-starring Rock Hudson, was a commercial disappointment despite her best efforts. Critics unfairly labeled it as too polished and out of touch, though Julie had poured her heart into it. The early 1970s brought further challenges. Hollywood's golden age of musicals was ending, replaced by grittier, more modern storytelling. The kind of films that had once made Julie Andrews a household name were no longer in demand. For the first time, she felt the sting of professional uncertainty. During this transition, she found stability and love with filmmaker Blake Edwards, whom she married in 1969. Their marriage became one of Hollywood's most enduring partnerships, lasting over 4 decades. Edwards understood her in a way few others did. He saw beyond the screen persona to the disciplined, witty, sometimes self-critical artist beneath. Together they built a blended family, adopting 2 daughters from Vietnam, and for a while, Julie found a balance between career and home. But the struggle to evolve creatively never left her. She worked tirelessly, trying to expand her range, appearing in comedies like 10, 1979, and Victor/Victoria, 1982, which earned her another wave of acclaim and an Oscar nomination. Those roles challenged her old image, showing audiences that the woman they had once seen as angelic could also be sensual, clever, and fiercely human. Yet even in her triumphs, she carried the weight of expectation. Directors admired her precision, her professionalism, but sometimes mistook it for emotional distance. She often confessed in interviews that she felt pressure to always be the good girl, to smile, to represent grace even when she was exhausted or doubtful. The discipline that had defined her since childhood was both her armor and her prison. Every note she sang, every performance she gave, was the result of tireless control, a need to be perfect, to never fail. She had built her world on her voice, her reputation, and her ability to deliver magic on command. But perfection always demands a price. And Julie Andrews was about to pay it. In the years ahead, an unexpected twist of fate would shatter the one thing she had always relied on. The gift that had carried her through every triumph and sorrow. What followed would test her in ways even she could never have imagined, leading to one of the most heartbreaking chapters in her life. By the late 1970s, Julie Andrews stood at a crossroads. The era that had made her a star, the world of polished musicals and fairy tale heroines, was long gone. Hollywood was changing, and so was she. Yet what made Julie truly remarkable was not her fame, but her quiet resilience, the ability to adapt, to reinvent, to find purpose even when the spotlight dimmed. Her marriage to filmmaker Blake Edwards became her anchor. Together, they were opposites that fit perfectly. He was known for his biting wit and unpredictable creativity, she for her grace and discipline. Their home life, though not without its struggles, was filled with humor, love, and the shared chaos of raising children. Andrews's daughter, Emma, grew close to her stepfather, and the family later expanded when Julie and Blake adopted 2 daughters, Amy and Joanna, from Vietnam in the 1970s. Family gave her something that fame could not: stillness. Away from the cameras, Julie was not the ethereal figure of her films. She was down-to-earth, funny, and surprisingly mischievous. She delighted in cooking, gardening, and reading aloud to her children, often doing so in character voices that made them laugh until they cried. But her creative spirit never rested. Even when Hollywood's gaze began to move elsewhere, she sought new avenues of expression. In the 1980s, she ventured into new territory with Victor/Victoria, a daring, gender-bending musical that showed she could still command a stage and captivate the world. The film earned her another Academy Award nomination and solidified her as one of the most versatile performers of her generation. Still, the roles became fewer as she grew older. The Hollywood she had once dominated was not kind to women who aged, no matter how talented. But Julie refused to fade quietly. She moved toward what she loved most: storytelling. Alongside her daughter Emma, she began writing children's books, combining her lyrical imagination with her lifelong love for words. Titles like Mandy, the last of the really great Wangdoodles, and later The Very Fairy Princess became beloved by readers around the world. Through these books, she shared her belief in kindness, courage, and creativity, the same qualities that had carried her through her own struggles. At the same time, she found renewed joy in voice work and narration, lending her unmistakable tone to films like Shrek 2 and Enchanted. Even as her singing career waned, her voice, gentle, wise, and filled with warmth, remained her most powerful instrument. She also dedicated herself to humanitarian work, supporting arts education and children's charities. Audiences saw her less frequently on screen, but those who followed her life knew she was living with quiet purpose, grounded in love and gratitude. Yet beneath the surface, something painful was unfolding. Something that would test her spirit more than any role or performance ever had. The one thing she had always relied on, the instrument that had defined her since childhood, was about to be taken from her. It happened quietly, without warning, in the late 1990s. Julie Andrews, at the peak of her maturity as an artist, was preparing for a return to the stage. She was to star in a revival of Victor/Victoria, a role that had once earned her applause night after night. Her voice, though older, was still strong, pure, and capable of moving audiences to tears. But during the show's run, something began to change. Her throat felt tight, her range diminished, and her once effortless notes came with strain. Concerned, she sought medical help. Doctors diagnosed her with non-cancerous nodules on her vocal cords, an issue that many singers face, and assured her that a simple operation could correct it. It was a routine procedure. Or so she was told. When she awoke from surgery, she immediately knew something was wrong. Her voice, the instrument that had shaped her entire existence, was gone. The sound that once soared over orchestras and melted hearts had become hoarse, fragile, and broken. "I went into the hospital to remove a small problem," she later said, "and came out with a catastrophe." The surgery, performed at Mount Sinai Hospital in 1997, damaged her vocal cords irreversibly. What was meant to be a minor procedure had ended her singing career overnight. She was devastated, not simply because she had lost her livelihood, but because she had lost a part of her soul. For someone who had spent her entire life communicating through song, the silence was unbearable. She described it as a kind of mourning, a grief so deep that words barely contained it. Her husband, Blake Edwards, stood by her side, offering unwavering support. But even he admitted later that the emotional impact was profound. "It was as if someone had cut the wings off an angel," he once said. The world, too, was stunned. Fans who had grown up with the Sound of Music and Mary Poppins couldn't comprehend it. How could the most perfect voice in the world simply vanish? Julie, ever composed, tried to move forward. She underwent years of therapy, hoping to recover even a fraction of her range. But the damage was permanent. Lawsuits followed, headlines spread, and for a time, she withdrew from public life. And yet, in the quiet darkness of that loss, she discovered a new strength. She began to speak, not sing, about resilience, healing, and acceptance. She turned her grief into purpose, embracing new creative roles that didn't require her voice but still let her inspire others. Her acting career found a gentle rebirth in the 2000s with The Princess Diaries, introducing her to a new generation who saw her not as the singer she once was, but as a symbol of grace and endurance. When she appeared on screen as Queen Clarice Rinaldi, elegant and wise, the audience saw more than a character. They saw a woman who had known loss and chosen dignity over despair. The tragedy of Julie Andrews' lost voice remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in entertainment history. Yet, in a way, it revealed the true measure of who she is. Her voice may have fallen silent, but her spirit only grew louder, echoing in her books, her roles, and in the millions of hearts she continues to touch. What she lost could never be replaced. But what she gave, through her pain and perseverance, became something far more enduring than a song. At 90 years old, Julie Andrews stands as one of the last living links to Hollywood's golden age. A woman whose life has spanned not just decades, but eras of transformation in art, film, and humanity itself. Time has softened her image, but it has also deepened the meaning behind it. When people speak of Julie Andrews today, they don't just recall the twirl of her skirts in The Sound of Music or the carpetbag in Mary Poppins. They recall the feeling she gave them: warmth, hope, the belief that goodness and grace can still exist in a complicated world. Her legacy is monumental, yet intensely personal. Few artists have managed to remain beloved by multiple generations for so long. Grandparents, parents, and children alike all share the same reverence for her voice, her smile, and the kind of purity she represented. But as the years have passed, the myth has melted away, and what remains is far more profound: the image of a woman who endured life's cruelties with elegance and strength. In interviews, Julie speaks with the gentleness of someone who has long made peace with her past. Her voice, softer now, huskier, still carries that familiar lilt that once filled concert halls. She laughs easily, reflecting on the roles that made her immortal, but she also speaks candidly about the pain of losing her voice. "It was devastating," she has said. But in a way, it taught me that I am more than my singing. I found new ways to express myself.
And she did.
Her second career, as an author and storyteller, has brought her immeasurable joy. Together with her daughter Emma Walton Hamilton, she has written over 30 books, from whimsical picture stories to insightful memoirs. Through them, she rediscovered her voice, not in song, but in words. Each story carries her touch, compassion, humor, and the unwavering belief in the resilience of the human spirit. Her influence continues to ripple through culture. Younger artists often cite her as an inspiration, not just for her talent, but for her grace in the face of hardship. In an era that glorifies perfection, Julie's quiet authenticity stands out even more. She never sought to be a goddess, she simply tried to be true to herself, and in doing so, she became something far greater. When she appears now, at tributes, award ceremonies, or rare public interviews, there's always a moment of silence in the room. People rise, not just out of respect for her fame, but for her endurance. They see a woman who lived through the shimmering highs and devastating lows of fame and came through it with her soul intact. In the twilight of her life, Julie Andrews remains the embodiment of artistry, humility, and resilience. Her laughter still rings like a melody, and her eyes still carry the spark of the young girl who once sang for kings and queens. The world may have changed around her, but her essence, kind, curious, and quietly brave, remains unchanged. And perhaps that is her greatest triumph, that even without her singing voice, she has continued to move the world with the music of her humanity. To understand why Julie Andrews' story is so heartbreaking, one must first understand what she represented. She was not just a performer, she was a dream personified. For millions, she symbolized everything good and pure, the voice of innocence, the smile of grace, the woman who could make life seem brighter just by appearing on screen. But behind that image was a reality far more complex. Julie Andrews was a perfectionist forged by necessity. From childhood, she had been trained to deliver, to sing flawlessly, to behave impeccably, to meet expectations that would break most people. The applause she earned came with invisible chains. She could never falter, never age, never crack. When she lost her voice, the world mourned not only for her, but for what she represented, the idea that even perfection can vanish in an instant. The tragedy wasn't just medical, it was symbolic. It was as if the universe had taken the one thing that defined her and whispered, "Now show us who you truly are."
And she did.
She showed strength instead of despair, courage instead of bitterness. She didn't retreat into silence, she transformed it. But still, the heartbreak lingers, because when she speaks about her singing days, there's always a flicker of nostalgia in her eyes, a quiet ache that words can't hide. The loss never completely healed, she simply learned to live around it. What makes her story so moving is that it mirrors the human experience itself. We all lose something, our dreams, our youth, our certainties, and we all have to decide who we are without them. Julie's tragedy is, in truth, universal. She lived it under the gaze of millions, yet her pain was the same kind that so many endure in silence. Her voice once carried entire generations through their childhoods. It filled theaters with hope, it turned songs into memories. To hear that voice silenced forever, it felt for many like losing a piece of their own past. That's why, decades later, her story still stirs tears. It reminds us that beauty, no matter how radiant, is fragile. And yet, perhaps the real miracle is that she found a way to keep giving. Even when her voice was gone, she continued to speak, to write, to nurture. She turned tragedy into legacy, pain into purpose. She showed that the human spirit can endure even when the very thing that defines it is taken away. At 90, she stands as a living lesson in grace. Her life teaches us that perfection is not in never breaking, it's in how we heal. Her silence, once filled with sorrow, now feels like serenity. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her, not in song, but in spirit, the soft, eternal echo of a woman who taught the world how to find music even in loss. If Julie Andrews' story touched your heart, if her journey from brilliance to heartbreak, and from silence to strength, reminded you of the beauty of resilience, then don't leave without showing your love. Like this video to honor her incredible legacy. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the stars who shaped our world. And hit the notification bell, so you never miss the next video of Hollywood's most unforgettable lives.